Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We're going to conclude, I believe, our discussion of The Music of Christendom by Susan Treacy. And if you can get by our graphic for the beginning of the show, which you must have done if you're still listening, please have patience. We're going to fix that thing at some point. It's an almost invisible blue background with people reading on their Kindles, and we want to have something which more represents what a real book club ought to be and who we are. And I want to apologize again. I wish I would have had this idea earlier, that what I've done this week and last week is I went to that list in the back of 100, pieces she thought that we should all have some familiarity with. And I picked one each for each chapter we're going to discuss. And it was very helpful, very helpful. So since we discussed this and people are still watching or listening, I would recommend you keep that book handy, and from time to time go to the back, those 100 pieces she mentions, and just go to YouTube and pick one out. I mean, I've been mightily impressed by the wonderful things you can get on YouTube. And a lot of them don't even have any ads because I guess there's not that many people want to watch them. But anyway, let's go with chapter 25, English Masters, Elgar and Vaughan-Williams. I turn the floor over to you, but I'm going to say something about Elgar, because I listened to his Dream of Gerontius. By the way, Joseph, do you say Gerontius or Gerontius?
It's like some Robert Southern and Robert Southwell. It's an inconclusive debate that goes on, but I've heard it pronounced both ways. I've also even asked etymologists, and there's no consensus even amongst them. So you can say it however you like, Father.
Well, I'll say Gerontius because it's from the Greek, geron, gerontos, and so that's a hard G. This is the famous poem by John Henry Newman, Saint John Henry Cardinal Newman, about an old man who's dying and going to heaven. And it's very beautiful, including a couple of hymns that Newman wrote also. Well, I might as well just say I listened to it. Elgar, who was a very devout Catholic, and he wanted to make his masterwork, the setting the music of this poem by Newman. And I've decided, I'll explain a little later too, that for me personally, when I'm listening to classical music or classical type music, I like to be able to find a beat or a rhythm somewhere. If I can tap my foot and find out what where are these measures? And secondly, I like to find some melodic thing there. And what I find in some of these people we're going to talk about today is that there's beautiful sounds and there's harmony, but I can't find a consistent melody or any kind of a theme that I can latch onto, and I can't get any rhythm out of it. And so I listen to this thing, and I know it's very popular, and people praise it and so on, but the poem does not come out as poetic because you get no rhythm or meter in it at all. You can't get the rhymes either. In fact, it's hard to know what they're saying unless you're following with a script. And then the music, for me, it's enjoyable in a certain sense, but it's not memorable. By the way, after I listened to all these things for this week's, chapters, I went back and I watched and listened to the Concertgebouw, Amsterdam Philharmonic of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. And everything that I like is there. There's contrast, and especially the way they show it on the video. You can follow as Beethoven takes a little melodic theme, and it goes from the flute to the clarinet to the oboe to the bassoon, and then it goes to the violas, and then the cellos, and they put them on the screen there. it's just marvelous. And the second movement, the Elgar, which some people think is the greatest piece of symphonic music ever written. I mean, I don't know. I like it very much, but they're so simple, so simple. I mean, you enter into it, So I realize it's probably not a good standard to use because maybe no one can ever meet that standard. But I understand now I personally, with my limitations, don't appreciate the lack of clear form which you find in Bach or Beethoven.
Can I actually comment upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. You can criticize, comment.
I actually know largely to agree. First of all, I basically do personally, and again, like you, I'm not an expert, not musically noused, but I also don't particularly enjoy Elgar's Dream of Gerontius. I think I prefer the poem as text rather than it's set to music. My favorite piece of Elgar's music is probably the Enigma Variations. So not the Dream of Gerontius. Your criticism about not being able to hear the words clearly and not being able to pick up the meter of the poetry, I agree with all of that. The only comment I'd make about the metrics not being as clear in maybe Elgar and Vaughan-Williams. First thing I would say is that Vaughan-Williams writes a lot of tongue poetry. So the Lark Ascending, for instance, is one of my favorite pieces of classical music, and that is really sort of trying to depict a lark ascending and singing, and so it's sort of visual, if you like, and I don't think it's trying to do what Beethoven's doing. And as regards tunes, I would merely point out that Vaughan-Williams has written some of the greatest hymns.
Oh yes, I love his hymns. His hymns are great.
Yeah, and I think he wrote the music to my favorite Christmas carol, In the Bleak Midwinter. I think he wrote the music to that. So obviously he can write tunes, but that's not what he's trying to do in the Lark Ascending, particularly. So
I didn't listen to Vaughan, so my view of Vaughan might have been different. I just went with Elgar here.
Right.
Vivian, any comments on this chapter?
No.
Or on us?
That was easy.
I have things I want to say about the next chapter.
All right, well, let's jump right. Let's jump right in then. The next chapter is France in the mid-20th century.
And like I mentioned the last time, or I should say, as I mentioned the last time, these French who are fervent Catholics in a time when that is not fashionable are very impressive people. And this Duruflé marrying a brilliant organ student, Marie-Madeleine Chevalier, yeah. And that they shared the post of organ master was interesting. And you don't see a lot of, there have been some male-female partners in music making, but I thought that was interesting to have a married couple share their faith, share their profession, share their lives. I just thought it was a beautiful thing. But I really wanted to mention something about Poulenc Father because his dialogues of the Carmelites are coming to the San Francisco Opera.
Oh, really?
This October.
Well, I assisted at a performance 30, 40 years ago here. It was where was it? I forget where it was, but anyway, it was phenomenal. It was beautiful.
Yes, I've seen it on live telecast in a movie theater, but I haven't seen it on, live on the stage. And I'm going to this time for sure. But speaking of women, I need to do a shout out here to Gertrude von Lefort.
Oh, yes.
Because she's the one who wrote the novel, The Song at the Scaffold.
That's right.
Which then Bernanos turned into a play, which then Poulenc based his opera on the play. So really it can be traced all the way back to Lefort. And it's a wonderful novel. It's a fantastic opera. But a lot of people don't know those links. and the reason why is because Lefort's modesty and humility, when it got turned into the play and turned into the opera, both the playwright and the creator of the opera tried to give Lefort more credit. And she demurred and said, I've done my work, you're doing your work. I do not need further accolades or royalties or anything else. And that's why she's often missed, just like here. So I just had to give a shout out to Gertrude
Well, that's
von
good.
Lefort.
And, you know, we Ignatius Press has published some of her short stories, which are marvelous.
They're fabulous.
And let's remind me of this. We should get someone to do a biography of Gertrude von Lefort. I mean, what a great influence she had in the church, and what a wonderful woman she was. But I don't know much about her.
Well, and you know, she was a good friend of Hermann Hesse, who was buried in a Catholic churchyard. I wouldn't be surprised if she helped him into the church, and he nominated her for a Nobel Prize.
Really? Huh.
So, no, fabulous, amazing woman, and her fiction is amazing. So anyway, we ended on a note about women last time, and I wanted to give high praise for, here's a brilliant woman who deserves more recognition.
Very good. Well, on this chapter, I decided to listen to something by Olivier Messiaen. And the reason I chose that was that when I was at Ave Maria, we had a wonderful music department, fantastic music department. And one of our students was studying organ there. And she did her recital, and she played something by Messiaen. And I was up there in the choir loft while she was playing, and the head of the department who was judging this recital, it wasn't a public recital, it was a practice for the recital. He was down by the sanctuary to kind of get the best, tone and everything. But I was so moved by the beauty of this organ piece by Messiaen. So I went and I listened to and watched Le Banquet Céleste, Celestial Banquet, and a quartet for the end of time. And I found exactly what Susan Treacy says on page 209, 6 lines from the bottom. The listener loses all sense of meter and time. Yes, that's right. And the sounds are beautiful. It wasn't atonal. There was harmony in there. But it was like one continuous flow of sound. And hey, the great thing is beautiful music for everybody's taste. I just have to say that my taste likes meter, some kind of meter. So I like to see some kind of order in the sounds.
I would say something, however, that she says after that immediately after what you've just quoted, the key signature of Le Banquet Céleste indicates F sharp major, a key that Messiaen frequently used to symbolize God. So, I think there's symbolism.
Well, yeah, but Joseph, I'm sorry that F sharp major, whatever that is, does not connect in my brain with God. Okay. What about A flat? Who does that connect with?
Well, I assume, and I plead ignorance, but I assume that the sound itself is what communicates, not the notation. And I assume that there's something about that particular, note that does that. I mean, I don't know. What I would say, I want to say about this. First of all, I personally love these three composers: Duruflé, Poulenc, and Messiaen. I'd like to put out a shout here that central to Duruflé's musical experience, this is page 205, as a cathedral chorister was Gregorian chant. In 1903, Pope St. Pius X had issued his motu proprio on sacred music, in which Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony were promoted. So again, there's this dialogue between the teaching of the Church on sacred music and these contemporary French Catholic composers, and I think that there's a dynamism there. The Church should be at the forefront of the dynamism of cultural renewal in an authentic sense of the word, and I think we see it there in the case of that motu proprio and the response of those three composers.
Well, I'll go back and listen to Duruflé. Let's see if she has one by him. Oh, a Requiem. She wants a Requiem. I'll go back and listen to that. Maybe, if I have time. Anything more on France in the mid-20th century? Well, I would say this about the mid-20th century France, you had great literature. You have Claudel, Péguy, Bernanos a little earlier, I think. And you had, in theology, you have Congar, you have de Lubac, Danielou, and many others. And I think in art as well, art and poetry, but I forget who they are, although Péguy, of course, wrote wonderful poetry. But despite the fact that France was a highly secularized environment where they had shut down the Jesuits and exiled them, which may not have been a bad idea, but there was a real Catholic flowering in 20th century France.
Yeah.
All right.
The Americans are going to leave to you folks, so I'm going to step aside for that chapter. Okay.
Well, the Americans. I'd heard Copland at a couple of symphonies I went to. I mean, concerts I went to down at the Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. But so, following her example, I went to listen to the Appalachian Spring, and I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, I felt like it was spring. There was a meter to it, and there were these kind of harmony, melodies that you could follow through. And then, I don't know, there was birdsong there. It really felt like it was a spring morning. I liked it. It was very, very good. It's also not
He also uses folk song melodies.
Yes.
He uses folk song melodies in different places. Yes, I love Appalachian Spring. But before that, Father, to go back to the Spanish New Spain in the New World, this Peter of Ghent, who starts the first school in Mexico to teach the arts to the Aztec population, she mentions him on page 214, and he baptized Juan Diego.
Really?
The man who saw Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Mm.
So that's a very important. Peter of Ghent was not only amazing in all these arts and so on, but he was a real missionary evangelizing in the New World, and for him to be the one to baptize Juan Diego is quite something.
Very good. It also says Jesuit missionaries were also active teaching and promoting music. And I've heard some of the music from the redacciones, in Paraguay. And they not only had these Guarani Indians playing and singing glorious polyphony, but they were making instruments. They were making cellos, and making violins and sending them back to Europe. It was amazing what they did. Anything else?
Well, then he, of course, he mentions. She mentions Ives, Charles Ives, and
George Gershwin.
And I don't care for Ives so much because he is got a lot of dissonance and so on. But Gershwin is phenomenal, and jazz was a huge influence on him. But his Rhapsody in Blue, his American in Paris, his stuff is great. I love his stuff.
I said I was going to say nothing, but I will say something.
Okay.
My favorite of all the pieces you mentioned is Appalachian Spring. I do like it. I do think that the folk music motifs are a bit on the surface and twee and cliched, but I do like Appalachian Spring. But Gershwin, I can see why people like like his music, but it strikes me that it's a little bit sleazy. I can see the attraction to it, but it's sort of like something you'd expect in a Parisian bar after midnight.
Well, he's writing in the 20s, the Roaring 20s.
That's right.
I know exactly. That's my point. I rest my case.
His if I grew up in Chicago, I live now in San Francisco.
Fleas.
Yeah, I do, and I like it. No, the energy of urban life. Some people just can't stand city life, and they just as soon as they can get out to the country, But I find city life full of energy and interesting people, and so I hear all that in Gershwin's music, right? And but
I mean, it's brilliant. It's brilliant,
Yeah.
and I can see the beauty in it. It's just that underlying sleaze for me, I feel a little bit slimy after I've listened to it.
I don't feel.
We can
Well,
agree
anyway,
to differ.
but
We can agree to differ.
But about the folk music, I also wanted to comment that she mentions here on 219 toward the end of the chapter how the folk music movement that sort of sprang up during the Depression, that there was leftist politics involved in this, the populism, socialism, communism, and so on. And that is the same thing that carried that sprang up again in the early 60s in America when the anti-war and so like people like Pete Seeger and then Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and these people, it was so interesting to see that there's been a cycle here that's gone round a couple times in America where when there's some kind of countercultural leftist pushback, that somehow they tap into the folk music. Joseph, do you want to comment on what's happening there?
Well, I mean, I find it curious and paradoxical, and of course, the complete opposite of the very unhealthy, at the other extreme, tapping into folk music of the Germans. German romanticism and how that leads to the Nazis and what have you. Whether it's because America doesn't have as deep roots, so even if you go into if it's American folk, you're still only talking about something that happened a century earlier. So, you can use it to comment upon contemporary things in a way that perhaps is not quite so simple if you're going to talk about folk culture that goes back several centuries. But I do find it curious and paradoxical that the left, which is very rootless and cosmopolitan, should actually employ rooted music in order to actually further its cause. It's odd.
And I think it had, like John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which is the same era. I think the American leftists came out of not only, although I think Pete Seeger was like some East Coast Brahmin family or something, he became, there's always these ironies, right? These educated bourgeoisie who then go lead the common people, right? We've seen this over and over again, right? But this romanticization of the common man, whether it's the working man proletariat or the field workers in California, I think there's something to the leftist cause that attracts people who romanticize this kind of this class, and then the folk music becomes a way to both reach them and proselytize. But, here going to public schools as a kid, and we're singing things like, if I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the... I had no idea that was part of the 20s communist socialist movement. It sounds like a patriotic song to me. This land is your land. This land is my land. Didn't you sing that? Who knew that there are a bunch of lefties singing these songs all over America to try to rouse up the common man?
Well,
anyway.
I would like you to do, for this period, I'd like the two of you to do a kind of a psychological musical analysis of me. Artistically, I always liked the Post magazine Norman Rockwell pictures, but I still don't really like opera, but I love musicals. Oklahoma, My Fair Lady would be the top of my list, but there's many, many others. Now, why is that? Is that too lowbrow or something, or what is it?
I love musicals too. I love them all. Singing in the Rain and The Sound of Music. I mean, what's not to like? South Pacific. I love them all. But I love opera too. But again, just like what you like. I don't think you have to apologize.
Okay.
I don't think any apology is necessary, but I do think that musicals are pop music, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, if you compare it with some of the great arias, Verdi and Puccini, of Wagner's operas, in terms of art, it's obviously working on a much lower plane. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with liking folk music. It's not a question of being inferior or anything, but I do think we should acknowledge that there are, if you like, as a hierarchy in terms of achievement and what's necessary.
Okay, I acknowledge it, but I'm not going to go listen to him. But I do going to.
There's a fabulous short story by Willa Cather called A Wagner Matinee. I sent that to you, Joseph. Did you read it?
Joseph?
Well, no, I'm looking puzzled because at the moment I have no recollection of either receiving or reading it.
Okay, I sent it to you when I discovered it.
You send it to me again, and mea culpa if I overlooked it. I will read it this time. I
think it's called A Wagner Matinee,
really?
By Willa Cather. And because we were emailing back and forth a little bit about Wagner, this was before we were doing this.
Right.
I sent it to you, but talk about these things all running into each other. This short story is amazing. Look it up.
Well, send it to me too.
Okay.
Or the link, because Willa Cather is mysterious to me. I mean, Death Comes to the Archbishop, of course, is probably most famous. She's not Catholic. And yet,
no.
What a Catholic sensibility. And then I liked Shadows on the Rock about the founding of Quebec, because that's where my ancestors came to,
That's right.
And she's just unbelievably good.
Yep, she is. So, yeah. All right.
All right.
Anyway.
Let's go. Final chapter 28. I'll say my negative thing, and you can maybe bring this back to a more positive, optimistic view. But I listened to this great mystic, Scott, James McMillan, Le Grand Inconnu, The Great Unknown, and I couldn't finish it. It was just sound. First of all, in the YouTube version, you click on it and you hear nothing. And then you hear a wave coming in, and then nothing. And another wave comes in. Okay, well, I went fast forward. I got to the music. But it was just, I don't know. It wasn't chaos. There was beauty there. But I don't know. It was like screaming and moaning and wailing, and the music was like that. I'm sorry. I'm just not going to spend my time on that.
Well, these are minimalists. That's the name of the chapter.
Minimal music?
And, minimalism is a musical movement that not everybody can get into. I've listened to Korecki. He's the Polish composer mentioned here, his Miserere.
Yeah.
And you do have to be in the mood for minimalism. It is it's its own experience, I think. And
can I make a suggestion? Because I largely agree about Macmillan's music. I don't particularly enjoy it. I don't know Goreski, so I'm not going to comment. From reading this chapter, I evidently should. But Arvo Pärt is one of my favorite composers, and he is a minimalist. But perhaps, Father, you'll do me the grace of listening to either Spiegel in Spiegel by him, or Cantum in Memoriam Benjamin Britten by him, which I think are both two of my favorite pieces of music. And also, if I may, just by way of saying that I'm also capable of being very lowbrow, in case anybody thinks I'm elitist, one of my favorite pieces of classical music, and this is confession time, is Philip Glass, who's mentioned in passing here, because I suspect Susan Treacy doesn't like him very much, but for good reason. He actually set a David Bowie album, Heroes, to music. And there's one piece of music from that called V2 Schneider, which I know the David Bowie track from my miserable youth. And what Philip Glass does with that to classicize it, that's the right word, turn it into classical music, I find marvelous. So I'm also capable of, being pop in a good or bad sense. But Arvo Pärt, I don't think is pop. I think Arvo Pärt is a great composer. And those two pieces of music, I think, prove it. I mean, it'd be interesting. Obviously, this will be postscript. Maybe we can begin next week's, if we remember, next week's book club by discussing whether you agree with me, the two of you, whether those two pieces of music warrant my
But
praise.
are those mentioned in this chapter? Those the ones
They're not. But now, unfortunately, she didn't mention those two by name. I'll send them to your father. I'll send you an email with the titles of them.
All right.
Yeah, and you, Vivian.
That's good.
Do you have anything, Joseph, to say about the Englishman John Tavener, who's also in this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, insofar as I've heard much of him, I've not been that impressed, which is why I haven't heard too much of him. In other words, you know, if you listen to someone and you're not particularly impressed, they go off your radar. Except insofar as you think, yeah, I don't think I like him. So then you become prejudiced, your pride, and then you don't revisit. So insofar as I have listened to it, I wasn't impressed, but that was years ago, and I probably should revisit.
And you know, I mean, all along, we've repeated in this discussion of this book, we have repeated many times that none of us are musically trained. We like what we like. We appreciate music. But, you know, a lot of the modern musical artists, they are experimenting. They are pushing boundaries out to see how far they can go. They are, and I think it'll be interesting to see 100 years from now.
But also, though, they're doing it by being rooted. So in the case of Arvo Pärt, you know, he's a bit like Gerard Manley Hopkins. His, you know, being avant-garde is rooted in his going back to Gregorian chant and polyphony and the music of the Middle Ages. And a lot of his minimalism is getting away from the very lush romanticism of the 19th century and trying to get back to sort of like a minimal Gregorian chant way of doing music. So it's avant-garde, but only by tapping into tradition.
So I think, you know, while everyone's entitled to like or not like or enjoy or not enjoy, you know, it's good to just like trying a different cuisine and just being a little daring with trying and trying to see, well, what are they trying to do?
But there's objective beauty. If I don't like Bach, it's not a problem with Bach, it's a problem with me, you know.
Yeah. Agreed. Absolutely. I agree. Father, might we perhaps finish with her postlude? Just two quick things from it?
Go ahead, sure.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I like the fact she finishes the final paragraph by a nod in the direction of contemporary, current Catholic composers. So currently, Catholic composers in the United States are contributing to a renaissance of Catholic culture. Readers are encouraged to discover the music of Kevin Allen, Daniel Naggs, Michael Kurek, Peter Kwasniewski, Frank LaRocca, Timothy McDonald, and Mark Nowakowski, among others. Rather than being cultural Catholics, let us embrace the music, both old and new, of Catholic culture. And then finally, middle of that page, she reminds us of Chesterton's famous maxim, which is very appropriate to this whole book, The Music of Christendom, that the role of the Catholic Church in the history of music. The fact is this, said Chesterton, that the modern world with its modern movements is living on its Catholic capital. And I think this book proves and shows that.
All right. So we will conclude now with the Music of Christendom. We'll have a brief comment on Arlo Pärt next week as we begin St. Augustine, City of God. We'll read the introduction and the first section on meaning of creation. And I would just say, it's a little preparatory warning here, Balthazar's introduction has a lot in it, which is very, very useful. It's also, as you get towards the end of it, there's a lot which is pretty deep and not as comprehensible as I would say Augustine is himself. So don't get discouraged. By all means, you have to read the section on the meaning of creation, which is absolutely phenomenal.
So how far should people read, including us?
That's it. The introduction and the first section on the meaning of creation.
Thank you.
Anything else, Vivian?
No.
No? All right. God bless you all. See you next week at the Forum Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.